Bienvenidos, Ushamadid, and welcome Anne Arundel Community College learners from CTS-130, Section 402, during the spring 2021 semester. This is the Cisco Networking Academy ITNv7 course curriculum for their Introduction to Networking course, the first of the 3 CCNA courses. And in this packet tracer tutorial and solution set, we're going to be taking a look at packet tracer activity 10.1.4, where we will be configuring initial router settings. And we're going to be doing quite a bit of configuration in this activity, so let's go ahead and dive in here. Now, this is how the activity starts. Literally, we have PCA and router 1. So we're going to take a look at the default router configuration, and this is our first experience with layer 3 devices from a configuration perspective. Now, the configuration of a router is very similar to that of a switch. A lot of the commands you're going to see will be the same, and I'm going to highlight a number of differences as well. So let's go ahead and get PCA connected to router 1. Again, as I mouse over router 1, you can see there is no IP address configuration on any of the interfaces. And so for us to hook PC1 up with an Ethernet cable, a straight through or crossover, would not be too logical right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down to the lightning bolt down here, which is our connections tab, and we're going to go find that rollover cable right here, that Cisco rollover cable, which is sometimes referred to as the blue Cisco cable. And we're going to connect it to the RS-232 port on the back of the PC. Keep in mind that modern day rollover cables, you'll find there's USB connectors that can be used, and on mine I have a USB to Thunderbolt converter so that I can plug it into my MacBook Pro and pull up secure CRT and administer devices locally. So here we are, right? We've got the Cisco blue cable. We're going to bring it over to router 1, and this is going to go into the console port. Very important that this connects to the console port. Now, once we've got this connected, we don't need any IP addressing on router 1 because we can come to the PC, go to the desktop, pull the terminal application up, simply click OK, and we are now on the CLI of that router through the console port. And you can see I'm going to give us a lot more room here. So this is a 1900 series router. This is considered an ISR G2, right? And G2 being second generation, integrated services routers, what the ISR stands for. And these are some of the older routers that are out there. And again, kind of getting a little long in the tooth, and they'll be going away soon. And as you can see, we are now at the default prompt for a router. So a switch says switch greater than, and a router says router greater than. All right, so what can we do from here? Well, let's get into privilege exec mode so we've got access to everything on the device. And again, same command, enable. We're running iOS software, right? And that's what's allowing us to run these commands that are similar to what we were doing on a switch. So it wants me to say show running config. And what are we looking for here? So we're looking for the host name. Well, the host name, and we'll answer these questions in turn here. The host name of the router is just simply router. It asks how many fast Ethernet faces does the router have? How many gigabit Ethernet interfaces does the router have? How many serial interfaces does the router have? And what's the range of the VTY lines? So we could sit here and play the return game, right? Which is where I go a line at a time. I could hit the space bar, right, to get down to the interfaces where I see, okay, we've got 2 gigabit interfaces, we've got 2 serial interfaces, and I'm going to guess 4 fast Ethernet interfaces. And we do. And then we can come down here and you can see the net flow information right here, and that's a protocol we'll be talking about in the last of the 3 Cisco courses. And then we've got the VTY line range of 0 to 4. So routers, you'll typically see 0 to 4, whereas on switches, you may see 0 to 15. And so just make sure that you're aware of that. Now, an easier way to see all of the physical interface information would be to say show IP interface brief. And we saw this when we worked with switches, because it would take a long time on a 24-port switch to kind of scroll down and try to figure out how many ports you've got. Where here we get a single pane of glass view of the interfaces that are available on this router from a Ethernet or a networking perspective, right? So serial interfaces, gig Ethernet, fast Ethernet. We don't see the console port here, right? Obviously, we don't see the VTY lines. But we do see all the information that we would need to know. And that would answer B, part 1B there. So display the current contents of the NV RAM. And remember, this is show startup config. And you can see it says the startup config is not present. And let's see if, and so that's flash 0. If I say dir question mark, will it show me NV RAM? And it does. And you can see we have no files. Now it's asking you, why does the router respond with this? Why is it that we don't have a startup config? Because if we don't have a startup config, how did the router boot? How did it know what settings to use? Well, remember, these are the default settings. They don't need to be in the startup config because these are going to be the settings if there is no startup config. And so why does the router respond with it? The startup config is not present message? Well, that's because we haven't saved the running configuration to the startup configuration. Remember, when the router, again, we're going to pretend that this router is brand new. We just took it out of the box. We powered it on. We hooked a console cable up to it. And then we went ahead and we got logged in via the console port, right? There are no settings. These are the default settings. Until I save the running config to the startup config with either the copy run start command or the write memory command, there will be no startup configuration. And it's really critical that when you're making changes to a device that you save your configuration every so often so that if for whatever reason the device reloads accidentally, you reload it accidentally, it gets turned off accidentally, whatever the case may be, power hit, that configuration that you want the device to have when it starts up is actually there. So we have to save that configuration. So now we're going to configure some parameters. And it talks about the prompt changing. Well, again, when we go into global config, we notice the prompt changes just like it did with the switches. So let's get into router 1, and we're going to configure some of the initial settings here on router 1. So we're going to go from user exec into privilege exec with the conft or configure terminal command. We're going to set our host name to be R1 for router 1. We're going to configure a message of the day. Remember, that's that banner MOTD. And we're going to go ahead and put in here unauthorized. Let's make sure we spelled that right. Unauthorized access is strictly prohibited. And we'll see if we get any points for this. And we did. We got 10 percentage points for that. So we know we typed it in there properly and matched our case on there. So now we're going to encrypt all plain text passwords. Now, this is a great time to review what takes precedence here and what happens when I say enable password, and the unencrypted password is going to be Cisco. And then I say enable secret, and it's a secret. Now, my question to you, when I say do show run and I pipe that to include enable, my question to you is if we have two passwords here to get into privilege exec mode to enable passwords, which one takes precedence? Exactly. It's common sense here, right? That the password that is more secure, the type 5 password, and that's what that number 5 is there, using the MD5 hash, is more secure, obviously, than that. Even if I was to put service password encryption on here, this would be a type 7. The enable password Cisco would then convert into a type 7, right? So be aware of that, and I'm looking to see if they have us do the service password encryption. I'm not sure they do, but we'll come back and do it so that you can see that again anyway. So if you have both of these configured, which in a real-world scenario you would not, chances are you're only going to have the enable password configured, and it's probably not going to be a type 5. So here's some value add information on this enable secret. And to talk about it, we need to come out here to a real Cisco router, or actually we have a switch here. Let's see if we can jump onto a router real quickly. And we'll come down to router number 8, and we did not get denied there. So let's get into global config. And if I say enable, and let's see if we've got it, and there it is, the algorithm type. So here's this third option that in Packet Tracer, if I was to say enable question mark, we don't see the algorithm type because the plain text password is something to be avoided, right? That enable password and then typing it in, even when we put service password encryption on there, because I can just copy and paste a type 7 and drop it into a million websites and get it decrypted. The MD5 hash is better. However, what you will be doing in the real world is you will be changing the algorithm type. Now, you can see here that they give you the opportunity to use MD5. However, type 5 passwords are not recommended, right? So, and again, if you can avoid it, there might be a scenario where maybe you're doing some kind of authentication between a routing protocol or HSRP or whatever the case may be, where you've got to use MD5. However, when we're talking about the enable password, these are the two encryption algorithms that should be used in the real world. For Packet Tracer, the type 5, and then messing around with the sort of plain text and even the service password encryption type 7s is okay, but know that the best way and the most secure algorithm is going to be the script algorithm. And then we say secret, and I enter my password in here. So now I'm going to type in ITS, it's a secret. And we're going to look over here one last time and take a look at the length. Here's our salt, right? And that's that with those what's in between the dollar signs there. That's what makes up the salt for this password. It's a one-way hash. And take a look at the take a look at the length of this one-way hash, right? Now, we're going to do a script enable secret password. I'm going to hit enter, and then we're going to say do show run include enable. And I want you to compare that to this, right? I mean, just looking at this, it should be abundantly clear that this, all things being equal, is going to be more secure. And something about the script algorithm, if you look into it, it's based off this sort of exponential kind of a protection. And what I mean by that is when you're trying to do a brute force attack against a script algorithm, it exponentially increases the amount of time in between each of the brute force attempts, right? So if you're checking for A, and then AA, and then AAA, or ABC, ABCD, right? You're trying to do a brute force attack and run through all of these different combinations. It becomes more expensive every single time you try to do it. And so it's a great protection against hacking attempts. And again, this is a type 9 password. The SHA-256, again, very solid, right? You could use the SHA-256 as well. However, I believe that script is probably the better of the two, right? And, and it's supported on pretty much all 15.x code. You're going to find support for script and SHA-256. So in the real world, you're going to change the algorithm type to either script or SHA-256 when permissible, right? There may be cases where you have to do MD5, right? If you're doing PAP authentication, that you can't do MD5 script or SHA-256. It's got to be the type 7. Has to be a type 7 with that, with the what did I say? With the PAP the CHAP authentication, it's got to be a type 7. It can't be hashed because you can't hash a hash, right? Which is what CHAP authentication is going to try to do. So we've got that sorted out. Now it's asking us to go to the console line, right? So let's go ahead and say line con 0, and it wants us to put the password on the line con 0 for let me in. Now, if I say do show run and we come all the way down here, what is missing from the console line? And again, it doesn't tell you to put this there, but we want to make sure that we do that, and that is login, right? To let the console line know that it's when someone's logging in that we want to prompt them with this password. All right, so we're going to verify the initial settings. Let me type in. I'm going to say write mem so we save our config just in case I exit all the way out. So if I hit enter, we should see the message of the day followed by the password prompt. And there it is. And that's that console line that knows when we log in to prompt for the password. So the password is let me in. And there we go. We're in user exec mode. So now I'm going to type in enable to transition from user exec mode to privilege exec mode. And I hit enable, and we are now prompted with the enable password prompt. But again, the question is, which of the two are we using? Well, remember, we're using the it's a secret, which is that type 5. If I was to exit out of, didn't want to exit all the way out. Let me in. I should have said disable. Let me in. And then if I was to type in here, what was the unencrypted? Cisco. If I was to type in Cisco, you see we get the prompt. For password, again, it's not taking it because there's a type 5 enable secret password configured. And so let me in. There. Whoop. Let me in. Was it? Oh, it's a secret. Sorry. It's a secret. Getting all these passwords mixed up in my head. All right. So we validated all of that. Why should every router have a message of the day banner, right? Well, there's legal considerations to take into account, as well as making sure that when someone's logging in, they know what device they're logging into. There's some tricks that you can do with that message of the day in order to provide some information to the person logging in about what device it is they're logging onto. But in larger part, it is a security concern and a security consideration, as well as a legal one to make sure that you're telling people, hey, if you're not supposed to be on this device, and hey, there's no, and how would they phrase this in legalese, there's no expectation of privacy and that you're being monitored and you consent to those things. And so that's why we want that MOTD on there. And again, if you're not prompted for the password before you reach the exec prompt, what console line command did you forget to configure? And on the console line, let me make sure I read that. If you are not prompted for a password before reaching the user exec prompt, we didn't put the login command, right? So it's almost like they might have been setting us up not to do that, right? Because they tell you, hey, go ahead and set the password on the console line, but they never tell you to put the login command there, right? So they may have been walking us into this. So enter the passwords necessary to return to the privileged exec mode. We did. Why would the enable secret password allow access? But the enable password no longer is valid. And that's because the enable secret takes precedence. And we talked about that. And again, we talked about those other algorithms that should be used. Type 8, type 9, with script type 9 being my personal favorite and recommendation. Again, I always like to err on the side of caution and go all out. All right, so if you configure more passwords on the router, are they displayed in the configuration file as plain text or encrypted form? Well, we already know that you can see right there, there's the enable password in plain text, and there's the console line password in plain text. So it asks us to save the config. But before we do that, why not jump back in here and say service password encryption? And then we'll save our config again. And I'll say show run, and you'll see that we get this very weak type 7 right here. That all I need to do is, all I need to do is highlight that, copy it, and this is how quickly this can all go down. And we'll say crack types, and take a look at that. Lots of websites. We'll just pick the first one right here. We drop that in there. There's the type 7 Vignere cipher. And there is the plain text password, Cisco, right? So just another reminder as to why we avoid, if possible, those type 7 passwords. Again, if you're doing CHAP authentication, you've got to use, for the username you create, you're going to have to use, if it's a locally authenticated CHAP configuration, you would be using the username with just a password, right, with a type 7 password. All right, so, whoops. So we save the running configuration. We backed it up and should have changed and all else the system. Let's see here. What command did you enter? So what command did we enter in order to save the configuration to the non-volatile, meaning it's not at risk of being wiped out if the router powers off or somebody reloads it or it gets unplugged and plugged back in. And so it's the write memory or the copy running config, startup config. And again, they're asking you here, what is the shortest unambiguous version? And you can see here, if I do W, it'll take it for write memory. I think what they're asking for, though, is if we take a look here for COP, so copy, run, start. No, so it thinks that's ambiguous. Let's do a question mark and see. So yeah, so copy, and then we'll say R, and was it the startup then that was the, oh, maybe that was where we got the ambiguous. Yep, so there we go. So cop RST is a pretty short way to do it. Again, I'm a big fan of write memory. And now optional, save the startup configuration file to flash, because we've got it in NVRAM, but in a lot of Cisco routers, in fact, in all the Cisco routers that I've worked with over the years, except for some of the really old models, you'll find that they have this compact flash slot in the back of the router. In fact, let's take a look at the physical view here of the back of this router. And let's get the Ink2Go drawing tool up here. And that little slot right here on the bottom right there, that'll be a compact flash slot, right? And that slot right there is another slot into which you can put those flash cards. And what it is, it's just basically an external memory device that I can save configurations to, I can save iOS images to, right? It's super, super convenient. However, let me make sure I'm clear about this, because this has happened to me multiple times, especially here in my lab where, you're just kind of in there ripping and running. Make sure that when you are ejecting and inserting these cards, that the router is turned off. I have lost probably a dozen cards that go into these slots because, I just run in there and, want to pop the card out or slide the card in to do an upgrade or whatever the case may be, and forgetting to turn the device off. I've had them, for whatever reason, just literally be destroyed and unusable after I do that. So these are the compact flash slots that can be used on the back of your routers. And on the 1900, that's what that looks like. So let's go back to, whoops, oh, okay. So you notice I clicked on it, right? And I tried to get to the CLI tab, thinking that, yeah, we're on the CLI. That's where we're doing our configuration. Well, the activity forces you to use that console cable. They're smart enough to know that you may try to click on that router and then just dive right into the CLI on the router, and they stop you from doing that. And so let's see what we've got here. Let's just make sure I touched on everything. Yeah, and so flash, right? And in fact, I think on the on this 2800 series, I think I've got 2 flash cards in here. So if I say dir question mark, oh, why is that? Oh, what is it? It's a secret, I think. It's a secret. I hope that's the password. Okay, good. All right. So if I say dir question mark, yeah, maybe I don't. I thought I had some compact flash cards in here, and I don't. On some of the larger, the 3945s I do. And so if you say dir all, this will show you all of the file systems. So this is flash, right? And flash is typically some sort of a card inside the router. But again, you can see here, I can create a directory of base configs that I could then load onto this router much quicker than I could configure it by hand. I've got a little tickle script here that I save in the flash directory, and this is non-volatile memory as well. Think of it as a hard drive that's inside, or a USB stick that's inside the device. and we can save things to it. And here is a backup copy of a configuration. And here you could create a directory and copy into the directory the configurations that you're saving. That way it doesn't kind of, clutter up this main top Flash directory, which you definitely want to avoid cluttering up. All right. So back over here, it wants me to do show Flash so we can see the Flash. And again, they've got some XML files in there, and they've got the binary, the bin file with the router iOS image. And again, this is where when you're doing an upgrade, you would place the iOS image. So how many files are currently stored there? Well, we see 3, right? It even lists them out, 1, 2, 3. Which of the files would you guess is the iOS image? It's got to be the one, just like when we looked at the switch, that's got that version number in there, right? Or the router nomenclature, universal K9. Okay, and so that's our router image. Why do you think the file is the iOS image? Well, it's because it's got all the iOS information in here in the image name. Now, it says copy startup config to Flash. And so this is how we can back up the startup configuration, because maybe somebody makes a mistake and they do a write erase and then they reload the router by mistake, right? At least this way we'd have a copy, and I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do because router 8 needs to have this done, the real Cisco router I'm working with. And so let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say copy startup config to Flash. Now, you could even give it its own personal name. However, if I simply, and I don't like this per se because, here's where you could put the file name as well. And this is where I would recommend that you change it, right? To something like, TP bond fee, and then today's date, 02/13/20221. And then maybe the CCR number that you're getting ready to work on, 8675309. And then hey, I made this, and you could even throw in here, and sometimes I put in here pre, right? So that it says this is the config before I go to do the CCR, the change control, right? Maybe we're making a change to the router. And then when I say dir, right, we've got a copy right here. And so let's see how we could take advantage. What's the practical use of this? How can I take advantage of this backup config stored in Flash? And here you see that's the size in bytes, right? And you can clearly see that the iOS image is the largest of all the files in here. So how can I take advantage of that? Well, it just so happens that I have this sub-interface configuration that took me, some time to put together for my lab so that I'd be able to quickly configure and unconfigure these devices. I want to be able to do that, right? So let me say show IP interface, show IP interface brief. And here are all the interfaces on this router, right? There's 2 fast Ethernet interfaces and there's 4 serial interfaces. But watch what happens, right? So let's pretend that this sub-base config is the backup file I just created, right? And that's exactly how I created that file, by the way, is I simply configured the router exactly as I wanted it and then did copy running config to Flash and named it sub.base.cfg. And then at that point, all I need to do is come in here and say configure, replace Flash : and then give the name sub.base.cfg. And what this command does is I'm basically saying replace the current running configuration with that configuration, whatever's in this file. We're going to overwrite it. And I'm going to hit enter. It's going to prompt me. It's going to say, hey, are you sure you want to do this, right? Because this is kind of the point of no return, where once I do this, every configuration option in that sub.base.cfg file is going to be applied. So I say yes, and you can see it locks the configuration, changes everything in the configuration, and now when I say show IP interface brief, take a look at all the sub interfaces, because at one point I had like 18 or 24 routers. Juniper, I had some Juniper routers as well, but majority Cisco. And I wanted to make sure that I could communicate with all those routers that run into a switch, right? Where I've got VLANs created so that if router 1 and 8 wanted to talk, they could do that by themselves. And you can see there's the IP addresses for all of that. And so again, imagine in a lab having to do this manually every time you wipe the equipment and want to start from scratch. Not very fun, right? Not very fun. So I configured everything, got it exactly where I wanted it, even with the loopback address here, right? Because again, we're probably going to be doing routing protocol work at some point. And I went ahead, saved the config into Flash with the name sub.base.cfg. And so now in my lab, I can quickly fire things up, reconfigure stuff, overwrite configurations, and I'm off and running with all the connectivity that I want. And it's all with that single command, config, replace, and then the name of the file you're using to overwrite the existing configuration. All right, well, we are at 100%. We took a look at a lot of good information here, right? And I'm so happy that we're now finally onto the layer 3 devices. So that is going to do it for this packet tracer activity on packet tracer 10.1.4, where we configured the initial router settings. And again, we took a look at the practical application of why you would save either the startup config or the running config, right? How would I use that in the future? And we just saw that. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.